Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Juan Camilo Osorio. I'm an associate professor here at Pratt Institute Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. I also serve in the New York City Planning Commission, although today I'm speaking on my behalf. It's really a pleasure to welcome everybody here in the room, but also online to Pratt Institute. And so on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Pratt's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, the City Club of New York, Full Frame Initiative, and the Center for Sea Rise Solutions, it's really a pleasure to have you here. I hope that you find our stellar panel interesting, that you pose challenging questions so that we can engage in a lively discussion. So before we start, I want to read a land acknowledgement. Pratt Institute is situated in Lenape-Hocking, the traditional and unceded homeland of the Lenape past, present, and future. The Lenape have been living on this land long before the United States was established, and their wisdom is essential to our time. We acknowledge that the genocide, theft of land and resources, forced migration, and systematic cultural oppression of indigenous peoples and nations have a long-lasting impact on the living conditions, mental health, and cultural lineage of indigenous peoples and nations. We acknowledge that the colonizers and their descendants have benefited economically and socially from the oppression of indigenous peoples and nations, and we commit to repairing inequity and rebalancing the power distribution. As learners and educators, we recognize indigenous peoples' nations' long-time traditions of making art and storytelling. We acknowledge the significance of their creativity and how often they are unrecognized as artists, designers, and writers, while their culture is appropriated and taken by other artists, designers, and writers. Only when we are informed of our past can we collectively envision our future. So we begin by properly naming the land we reside on and recognizing ourselves as involuntary immigrants to this land. We will actively work to challenge the legacy of settler colonialism and do its extractive and exploitative. I'm gonna very briefly sort of like list the members of the panel. We are going to be hearing from each of them through 5-minute presentations, starting with Katya Smyth, founder of Full Frame Initiative, who will discuss a humanistic well-being lens to improving adaptation efforts. We'll hear later from Walter Rodriguez Meyer, founding mayor at Local, also a member of the City Club's Waterfront Committee, who will be discussing the well-being of nature. Jainey Bavishi, Assistant Secretary with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a former director of New York City's Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, who will discuss nature-based solutions from the federal perspective. Later, we'll have Janelle Kellman. She's the founding executive director of the Center for Sea Rise Solutions, former mayor of the Sausalito City Council, and candidate for California's lieutenant governor. The presentation will be about the need for stronger leadership and community partnerships. And we will also be hearing from John Shapiro, former chair and now professor at Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, co-chair of the City Club's Waterfront Committee, and fellow with the Full Frame Initiative, who will talk about the magnitude of the challenge. So after the presentations, I will be posing a question for the panel and then facilitate a discussion with those of you and those in the chat who can post your questions by writing them in the chat. We will be working together to raise them and facilitate the conversation. So I think that with that, I want to invite Katya to the podium so we can get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks to my fellow panelists. Hello, everybody out there in virtual world. We're really, really excited to be here, and we're also really excited to the incredible response to this panel. The one thing that wasn't mentioned, which is particularly important for those of you not from New York who are here in person, is that we hope you'll stay around afterwards for conversation and bagels. There will be bagels afterwards. So important for well-being. So let's. Now I can use this. Okay. Don't look. We're going on. Shh. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Whoa, that's a lot. Okay. Oh, do you want to go? No, I'm going to.
Up to you.
We've dealt with New York traffic, so we're really starting the day in a way that it's culturally appropriate. I'm gonna just go so you can take a deep breath, and I'm standing here, and then John's gonna go, and we're, see? Adaptation, right? Okay. So, oh, I can't even go backwards. It's just not gonna let me, huh? Whoops. Can you help me go backwards? There we go. Okay. Phew. Here we go. Okay. So let me suggest a couple things. That as a species, we are all deeply hardwired to experience a collective feeling of being whole that also manifests individually. And that's what I mean when I say well-being. It's a blend of a number of things. Happy to talk about belonging and safety and connection and purpose and mattering and shame-free access to food and air and shelter and water and things. But fundamentally, what's really important to know is that this is something that is a drive that we are all hardwired for, but we don't all have the same access to it. And that is what I call well-being inequity. And well-being inequity has health disparities, wealth disparities, social disparities, environmental disparities as fallout. So that's a really potent taproot for us to be really addressing. So what I'm going to share with you today is a super quick tour of some design principles that over the last 15 years, the Full Frame Initiative has developed in addition to a science-backed, participatory, validated way of understanding well-being, to introduce you to some design principles that help us make decisions in ways that advance that increase well-being equity. And one of the things that we have been doing that we're really excited that I'm going to be sharing with you today is how we think about the well-being of, oh, for the love of Petunia. Okay. The well-being of people and planet as connected. Right. And so this is the premise. Just designing for the well-being equity of people and the planet enables us to make these better decisions about how, when, and the what of adaptation. So instead of exacerbating human-driven inequities across nature, including people, we can restore and regenerate. And what's important here, I think, is also to recognize that when we think about increasing well-being equity and adaptation, it's not adaptation to try to hold in place what we have now. We have so many problems resulting from this well-being inequity. I'd like us to think today about adaptation being an opportunity for us not just to address how we respond to climate change, but to address so many of the other challenges that are facing us. And this framework I'm going to share with you has been used in housing and to address community violence and to address a whole host of challenges. So that addressing climate adaptation doesn't have to be one more thing on top of all those other things, but we can actually recognize that all these issues are bound together. Okay, so really quick tour. If I can get this to work. Okay, so first principle, we just need to start with what matters, which is well-being. And that is really different from starting with economic return on investment. That's short-termism, a lot of the things that actually undergird how we make decisions. And this is about the well-being of people and the well-being of the planet. The second principle is that we need to co-create. This is about centering the community, centering power, shifting power to those that are closest to the impact of the decisions that we are making. But we need to recognize this, it's not just people that are central to the decisions that we are making. The water, animals, plants are absolutely central. And they may not have a voice in the same way that we think of voice, but water has paths it takes when there's floods, right? This is, Walter may talk about this project. This is a picture from one of Walter's projects in Puerto Rico, right? Which is about how do you actually recognize that when there is too much water, water has particular ways that it wants to get back to the ocean. And so how do you build in ways that harness that recognize that instead of trying to block it? And so there's a huge parallel in terms of how we also recognize the power in nature and the power of people. Oh, good. 1 minute left. Okay. Here we go. Do I get extra for the not being able to get the slides to advance? I'm pressing every button known to man.
Don't press every button. That was really thanks.
Want to go forward? I want to go forward. Just forward. Okay. Heal and regenerate and get the tech to work. This is a picture from what happens after forest fire, the huge forest fires in Australia. We know that nature tends to heal and regenerate. What we also know about people as well as nature is that the process is as important as the product. And we tend to, in our dominant culture, focus only on the product. And where the harms have been held is often in the process that led to the harm, the process that led to the fires, the process that led to the disenfranchisement. So we need processes that are healing and regenerative, as well as outcomes that reflect that. I think I just need help. I think I'm codependent. Like the next, so I think the next principle is that we need to recognize that we're all intertwined and connected. And yes, please. Why does it work for you? Maybe you should just stay here. Thank you. Thank you. So we need to foster these webs of connectedness and what I call connection capital. There are many kinds of social capital that get a lot of attention when we're thinking about equity, but I'd like to suggest that part of what has happened is that we have gotten so cut off from nature that we don't even realize that there is a kind of social capital that is the capital that we have with nature. And we need to understand that as a really important kind of capital, as well as our sort of the capital that we have in terms of our connection to our ancestors and the fact that we are ancestors. And those are things that many of us think about, but that are not built into the ways that things are studied, the ways that decisions are made, and yet they affect us deeply. This is a picture of how trees work. Trees talk to each other, and we need to plant trees in ways that they're going to talk to each other because they will help protect us and help protect the rest of nature better. We need to span boundaries of fields and of sectors, but we also need to recognize ecosystem diversity. I learned yesterday that the United Kingdom has just put in place a requirement that any new development increases the biodiversity of that place by 10% or more. And they have to sustain that for at least 30 years, right? When we do that, it is better for the people as well as for nature. We don't have to pit these things against each other. So spanning boundaries, I did it. And then we need to recognize that we need to build on the assets and innovations that are already existent. And we think of this as asset-based, asset-based work and for people is something that people are sort of talking about as a buzzword, but this is actually what evolution is. Evolution is recognizing that there are things that are adaptive in some situations that we need to learn from and that we can learn from. So we need to evolve. And I will just close by saying that one of the key principles about the evolving is recognizing that if we are done, we're finished. That the work of adaptation is not about how are we going to adapt and then we're good forever. No, that the work of adaptation to climate change, to everything else is about a continual feedback loops with the environment. And we just need to play some catch up now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. And you can scan a QR code to learn more. John.
Oh, and I can just press this button. Great. All right, well, Juan Camilo is getting it all set up. Thank you very much. Sorry to be delayed. It wasn't just the traffic. I was picking up bagels and coffee. So there's so we'll have a chance to continue the conversation for as long as you guys want here, and then as even longer out there. We have the room till 11. So we're actually till noon. And there's some great people in this room. Thank you very much, Layla, who runs the City Club of New York, and Michael, who runs Waterfront Planning. And there's others who I recognize, but I'll quickly move in. So I'm going to take a step back, which is the problem we're facing is not just ideation, coming up with the right solution. Microphone. Oh, thank you. It's not just coming up with the right ideas. It's also getting the tough decisions made and getting the real bucks, not demonstration projects, not proof of concept, but real bucks being spent. And this is just New York City from the last 2 years. Oh, great. Thank you. So, our only advantage is time. We've got decades to do this if we start now. And so the question is, how do we prompt that? Because I don't think it's just a question of the wrong mayor, the wrong this, the wrong that. it's that it's in no one's real interest, and I mean no one, political leadership, the Joe the plumber, et cetera, to make sacrifices now for a theoretical person 50 to 100 years from now. So I think in a certain way, our internal debates about whether it's this type of green infrastructure or that type of green infrastructure feeds into that loop, that we don't have to make a decision yet. So how do we move this conversation along? One idea that we're putting out there centers well-being. And the idea of center of well-being is that if we make this not about per se a pessimistic story of how we save humanity from a dystopian future, but how we actually move into a better future. I, for shorthand, call it next New York City, next NYC. You can give it any name you want. I'm going to use New York as an illustration, but we need to be mindful that it's not just climate change. You know, if we're talking about 50 years, anything that's a concept now can be brought to scale within 50 years. And there's a lot of technology, a lot of change, a lot of growth in wealth that'll come from robotics that we can start to tap, and AI that we can start to tap into. So how do I illustrate this? And these are just illustrations because they're off the top of my head. And I know that if I showed them to my friends at Pratt, where I'm a professor, they'd all be poking holes, showing why this idea needs to be changed and so forth. But just to get a conversation going, what if we don't think about the water as enemy, but we start to think about new types of construction, floating structures in the Netherlands, buildings as flood surge protectors in Germany. If instead of trying to do just green infrastructure, we followed the example, for example, of Philadelphia's Horticultural Society, where they worked with the Germantown Development Corporation, Greater Germantown Development Corporation, and greened the whole neighborhood. And green infrastructure is just part of that bigger well-being story of health. If we think about not just barriers, but there's no such thing as a barrier without public access, that the entire waterfront can become a national park or a state park or a combination of different types of parks and wetlands and reconstruction of nature. Very important. I think right now the federal policy is that Kamala is proposing is largely about giving starter homes and homeowners. What have we thought about it as the way Hong Kong has thought about it, as how do we create a pipeline of housing and not just addresses the current need, but keeps pumping as we have to relocate millions of people due to climate change and hopefully take our fair share of international climate migration. What if we, in moving the 10%, that's 1 out of 10 public housing tenants in the nation, if instead of moving them into new public housing, we use this as an opportunity to create social housing. For example, Ron Schiffman of Pratt has an idea involving Atlantic Terminal, one of the biggest development sites in New York, to use it to absorb public housing as part of a new social housing model. AOC's idea about a Green New Deal can be the inspiration of how we do relocation. It's not just relocation, it's jobs, it's job training, it's opportunities for better schools and better services and 15-minute cities and the like. If we think about industrial design for industry as something different, Sunset Park, the group Uprose has done a spectacular job in saying, let's not just retool for the climate change, let's make this into a neighborhood story. And each of these, this presentation will be up. You can take a look at them. My favorite is an idea of Ilya Azarov that we should have a mini sewer treatment thing, called it like a boiler in every building so that we don't have to rely on all those sewage treatment plants that are in fact going to be underwater. And this is not unprecedented. This is basically the story of New York City between 1810 and 1860, when we knew that the Erie Canal and the railroads and immigration would change everything. So how do we get there? Well, one is combining small ideas with big ideas. And I think we need those big ideas because that's where people that's the beacon. that keeps us moving in the right direction over a period of years. And I would say that this is, if we center well-being, you know, the point will be not how do we deal with this dystopian future with all of the climate angst that brings for the younger generation. And I think if any of you have teenagers, you know what I'm talking about, or young adults, you know what I'm talking about, but one that gives people what can be called pragmatic optimism. You recognize the problems, but you're proceeding with optimism that you can solve them. And that's where I think well-being can center. Now, I've talked mainly about well-being for people. Our next speaker is going to address well-being for nature, picking up on some of the themes that Katya brought up.
Hello, Walter Rodriguez Meyer, Principal of Local Office, Landscape and Urban Design here in New York City. We're building a lot of stuff in the tropics as well as the 3 coasts of the United States. And I'm also a professor at Stanford University. They have a new facility in Manhattan on Broadway and 23rd. Normally this is an academic presentation, but we have a lot of folks in the audience that more different disciplines and different expertise. So taking it a little more personal to start with to understand the ethos of our firm. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Mark Nelson, who's here. He was the chief scientist of Surfrider Foundation, and he's now the head of Surfrider Foundation. I just want to thank that work that they're doing across the nation on centering communities and nature. Katya and I have the same energy. The slide on the left is the Chibcha First Nation. This is my mother's motherland. This is, my mother was born in the indigenous city of Chia in the Bogota Valley. Because her tribe had gold, they were snuffed out by the colonists quite early. But in the Northern Territory and Costa Rica and the areas north, they were largely biogeochemists, textiles, clay, and their culture is intact. And so I was recently married, so I still have the wedding glow in Costa Rica. And I reached out to the Chibcha tribe near where we're getting married, which was Golfo Dulce. It's the most biodiverse place on the planet, really important for us as a people to experience what nature was like before humans in a way. The matriarchal society, much like my mother's, is called the Noves tribe, and the chief is a woman, and her name is Cacica Idalia. Cacica means woman chief. There on the right, officiating our wedding. And the thing I want to point out is, much like a lot of the pan-indigenous thought of the Americas, Pachamama has equal human rights as people, right? That's considered the same. The other thing is that nature, since the last ice age, has evolved with communities, with people, right? So the indigenous thought is that we're inseparable from nature. The other thing is that it's less about the individual and more about a sense of community over time, not just your community today, conveying power rather than concentrating it, but communities over generations before and generations to come. And that well-being of nature is truly at center, a cultural act. So we switched to my professional work. The ethos of the firm is to connect the dots between that ancient traditional knowledge and latest technology, science, and evidence-based decision-making. I want to share with you a study from FIU, Dr. Leonard Cinto. Dr. Leonard Cinto's work was the first to connect the dots between urban heat and lowering groundwater using trees as living pumps. But planting trees is not enough. This is a photograph of where I grew up. My mother immigrated to Miami and I was born in Miami. This is the tree islands of the Everglades where Miccosukee and Seminoles lived and understood these systems, the relation between heat and groundwater, and occupied these tree islands. But Dr. Leonard Cinto's work came out in 2015. And what he found, if you look at that graph, that over a month, the groundwater was lowering 1 foot, as much as a 1/4 inch per day in some cases. And then it would rain, it would come back. And so what I want to share with you is how can those tree islands be turned into our cities? And it wasn't about the trees, it was about the soil. The soil was porous and allowed the trees to connect to the groundwater and to each other, and you get less disaster recovery costs because trees don't fall down in storms and they don't upheave sidewalks and cause liability in cities. So we had a commission in 2016 to redesign Miracle Mile in Coral Gables, 1 year after that study was finished. And I took Dr. Leonard Sninter's work and I said, how can we have science-led design decision-making to reshape our cities at a time when we were moving from 10-year stormwater design to 100-year was sophisticated, but we need to be 1,000-year, right? And those are happening 3 times a summer. So it's happening in New York now as well. And so you can read about New York Times about this project if you Google Miracle Mile in New York Times. But taking Dr. Leonard Sninter's work as a system in the city, as a soil design where the streets are porous, the entire roadbed from right of way to right of way, not just the parking areas, the travel lanes. And when you do all of this, excavate the right of way, put in Cornell University structural soil, it then creates something called a living street, for lack of a better term. And we need to integrate art into this. I've had the honor of working with Ai Weiwei, Agnes Dennis, all these incredible artists who were my heroes are now working peers, and incorporate climate art that takes the invisible and makes it visible. In this case, the sculpture on Giralda Plaza, which we designed, captures wind energy and makes it an aesthetic expression. I'm going to leave you with this last video. This is touching on well-being for families. This is a Hispanic immigrant to Miami. She didn't have insurance coverage. Hurricane Irene came through Miami. It took many months to recover. Her shops were, she had many shops around Miami, but only one of them stayed open the next day, and it was the one on Miracle Mile. And Miracle Mile used to flood every summer afternoon. So hopefully this video will run. Let's see. May not have audio. We have
Acá con este, hay uno aquí. Más lindo se ve así. Currently, I have 3 locations in Miami, one in Brickell, one in Surfside, and the one here in Coral Gables. I love being able to be an artist. Razzle Dazzle is like a throwback in time to a different era. The recovery after Irma was horrific in some of my locations. It was like a river. The water backed up, went right into businesses. It was a long time for the businesses to recover. You always worry about these things. When you lose one day of business, it's horrible. So I'm very, very fortunate that things were done on Miracle Mile to help the business owners. We boarded up to protect the windows. We didn't get flooded. We were able to open up the very next day.
So leave it there. She feeds 12 families with that business. And we need to remember as we shift from the age of resiliency and the emerging age of regeneration, to that we all can explore our ancient roots and explore our heritage, our epigenetic heritage, and its relationship with nature. Thank you.
Good morning. I am not modeling well-being today. However, I am happy to be here and I'm going to try to speak as audibly as I can, but I'm not sure I know how to do this. It's not my presentation.
Keep going.
Oh, there, okay. Okay. My name is Jainey Bavishi. I serve as the Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Atmosphere at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I am going to really sound like a bureaucrat after that presentation. However, this is some really cool stuff. So as far as bureaucracy goes, I wanted to tell you a little bit about a couple of projects that NOAA is involved with that focuses on nature-based solutions. As an orientation to this space, NOAA is all about nature-based solutions for adaptation. And we really are a boundary spanner in this space. We provide the science to really understand the benefits of nature-based solutions. We provide services like decision support and capacity building to increase the capacity on the ground to implement nature-based solutions. And then we're also providing stewardship, so the implementation of nature-based solutions through policies, programs, and partnerships. So like I said, I wanted to share a couple of examples. This is the first one. And really my examples are meant to highlight co-benefits. How can we invest in solutions that are increasing the safety and resilience of communities that are at risk from the impacts of climate change, but also provide other amenities. And that's really like the sweet spot, and other amenities that promote well-being. So here you see a defunct golf course. There we go. Okay. A defunct golf course in Clearview, Texas, that was repurposed to provide stormwater retention and a nature park. And the community was very clear. The community was involved in providing input into this project. NOAA actually funded the hiking and biking trails in this park. That they didn't just want stormwater retention ponds. They wanted there to be an amenity. They wanted an asset to the community. And so this is what was created. But I love this quote from one of the residents. Not only does my house not flood anymore, but I'm getting my husband to exercise because of Exploration Green. Now that to me screams well-being. Another example in Wilmington, Delaware, Southbridge Wetlands Park. Again, NOAA provided funding to this project in 2 different rounds to help restore this degraded, contaminated area that used to be a functioning wetland back into a functioning wetland. So it serves as a natural stormwater management solution. And this park is now helping to protect the nearby community of Southbridge, a historically Black neighborhood, from regular basement and street flooding. But it also includes a boardwalk, trails, connecting residents to recreational opportunities, but also creating connectivity between this neighborhood and jobs and retail. Another quote from a resident in Southbridge: this has been a community effort from the time it began. We are taking care that efforts will be made not to uproot present residents. This will put a positive focus on a community that has not been looked upon positively for a number of years. A couple of features that I think are really key to advancing and accelerating these kinds of nature-based solutions. First of all, we've learned that community ownership is really key. These are also photos from Exploration Green back in Texas. And not only do the residents provide input into the design of the project, but they're also very involved in maintaining the community gardens, the tree nurseries. This is a couple of photos of volunteers planting a tree. And that's really been an important key to the success of the project. But then also another factor that's very important is money. We need funding to be able to implement these kinds of projects. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act have provided what we often call once in a generation funding opportunities. NOAA has deployed $6 billion from these pots of funding to support things like restoration and resilience. It makes me very nervous when we call these pots of money once in a generation, because the demand signal is very clear, right? We, as an example, NOAA had a climate resilience regional challenge, a $575 million pot of funding that received $16 billion in eligible applications, so 28 times the amount of funding available. And that's a one-time program. So I think we're at the start of a paradigm shift to be able to invest in proactive, equitable coastal resilience and resilience more broadly, not just coastal. However, NOAA really does care about the coasts. And we really need to tell the stories of impact through these investments we're making to be able to make the case for continued investment. And then lastly, Another accelerator for nature-based solutions is just building capacity in places you might not normally think of it existing. So NOAA is, again, a champion of nature-based solutions. We have other partners in the federal government, like the Department of the Interior, but we're working with our agency colleagues. For example, the Department of Transportation. They just recently put out a nature-based solutions for coastal highway resilience guide, which NOAA helped to develop. This is about building capacity in agencies like Department of Transportation. Another example is with FEMA. NOAA and DOI actually worked with FEMA to invest, I believe, $38 million in hazard mitigation grant program funding into coral restoration in Puerto Rico. This has never been done before. So it's really the start of a paradigm shift in terms of what hazard mitigation grant program dollars can be eligible, or can be, what kinds of projects can be eligible for that funding. So we look forward to seeing more of that, and we'll certainly be doing our part. And I think I will end it there. Look forward to your question.
Okay, so I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to start with the ending, which is it's not going to be easy. We have creative willpower, we've got regulatory willpower, we have once in a lifetime funding, and now we need to change the way we think about this. And so I sit at the intersection of nonprofit work and local government. I'm the former mayor of Sausalito, California, the first beautiful city over the Golden Gate Bridge. We are a waterfront city, and I run a nonprofit focused on delivering nature-based solutions, enabling coastal competency amongst leaders around the world. So when I see this slide, I think about how do we get there? And really my end story for you, okay, my end story for you is really that it's going to take visionary leadership across different scales and different sectors. But as has been alluded to, it's going to take an understanding that we are interconnected with nature. And how do we merge those in the frame of politics? So I actually updated this slide after being on a plane yesterday because it was missing this idea that we are interconnected with nature. So of course, we know that building efforts today, there's policy, no matter what you do, there's not enough community engagement. And of course, we need to bring in public-private partnerships in order to find the financing and the resources. We all know that. But truly, what we need to avoid is this idea that there are trade-offs, right? And so the environmental ethicist from University of California, Davis, Dr. Rebecca Milstein says, we could seek to answer the question of what is biodiversity, but then the question becomes, what should we preserve? And I'll posit a third question, who are we to decide? Whose red grapes of wrath? Okay, so little known fact, Steinbeck, Joseph Campbell, and an intertidal biologist by the name of Dr. Eric Ricketts found themselves in the post-depression in Pacific Grove, California, right along the beach. And together, they evaluated how they might encounter nature. The hero's journey, which, as Campbell writes, is about overcoming this dystopia within us in order to do something better for more folks, right? How do we get there? And so Grapes of Wrath, the reason I mentioned this, written in California, about California, really highlights land use, climate change, and the social inequalities we still see today, right? Almost 100 years old. And so the theme and what I get from that is that we actually cannot disassociate ourselves from nature. We can't see ourselves as Aldo Leopold, who wrote the seminal work, Sand County Almanac, one of my favorite, Thinking Like a Mountain. We can't find ourselves to be this conqueror of the land, like Henry Nash Smith wrote in The Myth of the Virgin Land. We can't be the conqueror. We have to be a part of it. We have to be a citizen of the plain. And how do we do that? Nature-based solutions, right? Let's restore marshlands instead of putting up seawalls. Let's find ways to develop living streets. I'm going to bring that idea back for sure. That's an incredible project. I'm glad you shared that. We have to partner with nature, and we have to do so in a way that engages local decision makers and communities so they understand this is a part of our history as much as it is a part of the world's history. So how we're doing it in California, you may have heard of something called 30-30. The controversial conservation biologist E.O. Wilson many years ago said that if we want to retain who we are as a species, we have to save at least 50% of the planet. That messaging got a little diluted and we decided it would be 30%. I don't know why, but nonetheless, California and many other jurisdictions and countries have embarked on a 30 by 30 initiative. Conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. How clever, right? We are about 25% of the way there when it comes to lands Now, we started with a lot of land in conservation. That's about 7 billion acres of land, and we need about 16 million more acres of waterfront. But what's so notable about this project, and this is a very boring slide, so I'll just skip ahead to the next one. What's noticeable about it is the manner in which we interact with indigenous communities, with the land, with those around us, and with future generations in terms of how we plan. The number one bullet here is ancestral land returns. Thank you for the land acknowledgement. In California, I start in Sausalito with where the unceded territory of the coastal Miwok. This is a big part of this, acknowledging where we came from and who we have to thank. It's a large portion of why we're not, actually why we are undergoing massive fires in California, because we forgot about the indigenous lessons around periodic burns. And now we're returning to that and understanding that more. Voluntary conservation easements, enhanced protection of lands. This is moving in the right direction. I don't know if it'll be fast enough, but we're trying. There's a great website. I'll just put it up here. You can explore the priorities. One of the things, and I want to mention it, is the emphasis on protections for climate vulnerable communities. We are seeing amongst the 5 big issues in California, which is flooding, which is drought, heat events, fire, and sea level rise. We are seeing more engagement with the vulnerable communities, but again, not nearly enough. But I also want to mention that in addition to these flashy 30 by 30 projects, right, we also have things that are happening at the local level, something called local hazard mitigation plans. It's how we plan on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction level, often at the state, often at the city, and sometimes at the county. There's a big push now to mandate inclusion of adaptation resilience strategies in these local hazard mitigation plans. So what else can we do? I know that Jainey's going to be talking about this later this week. More emphasis on higher education and workforce development, and overtly bring well-being into 30 by 30. Lots of opportunity to expand vocational and apprenticeship programs with an eye towards the green energy transition, the blue economy, and do it in a way that creates intergenerational equity and well-being embedded into our community. So again, I'll just conclude here because I'm out of time. This slide, effective climate adaptation requires visionary leadership that can bridge scales and sectors. Sure, we know that. And it requires an understanding and belief that we are interconnected with nature and part of the solution, part of the planet's problem at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists. We have a really cool landscape to engage in a conversation now. I'm gonna start the discussion by trying to, bring to light something that you can easily begin to identify as we were hearing each of them, given the complex, different, and in some cases competing perspectives. How do we strike a balance between citywide, regional, or national, in some case, goals, big picture goals, with local priorities? So we heard a little bit about, what are some of the tools and techniques, but I want to offer each of you an opportunity to maybe sort of like highlight from what you said or what you've seen, what do you think works in terms of achieving that balance?
I'll jump in. I'm closest to the microphone. So in California, there's an amazing group in the Bay Area called SFEI, or the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And I'll just say it takes one word: science, right? They develop operational landscape units, which instruct us to plan for sea level rise in a regional fashion that coordinates hydrologic connections and ecosystem connections as we plan. And so in the Bay Area, we were looking very, very closely at how do we move beyond mere collaboration, but more towards coordination based on science. And I think that will help bridge the gap between local projects that fit into a larger regional plan.
I'm happy to chime in. Obviously, I've had a very successful climate week so far. That's why I sound like this. No, I think that it's really important for federal processes in particular to really receive and honor place-based and local knowledge. I know at NOAA, as we think about sort of all the different, we're a science agency, right? So as we think about the different types of science that and different types of knowledge that are important to us, place-based, local, indigenous knowledge is a key input into the work that we do. And Janelle talked about 30 by 30. I didn't talk about this in my remarks, but we're currently leading one of the most active national marine sanctuary designation processes that has ever occurred right now, 6 national marine sanctuaries being designated at the same time. And these are processes that really prioritize local input, local leadership. And I could go on and on about other processes that sort of are structured the same way. So I think that's really important is sort of crafting these processes so that local leadership and local knowledge are really central.
I think what I would add is, hopefully folks, I certainly am inspired by listening to the other folks here. I hope that everybody here feels like, oh, there actually are solutions out there. But the other thing underneath everything that everyone said here is that what we're all really talking about is values. And I think that there is a lot that happens in the climate space that is highly, highly technical. And often where things really break down between local, regional, federal is battles between what seem like technical solutions that really are about values and power. And so to me, they're also, that's why I sort of start with these principles, which are, so how do we actually get aligned and be really explicit about what the values that have to animate these decisions are? And then allow for more local manifestations of that in ways that make sense and center power. But if we're not really, really clear that this is about making decisions on a very different values frame than we have made them, that, the values that got us to this point are not the values that are going to get us out of it. And we have to be really honest about that.
Thank you for that. Walter.
I'll be brief. So our firm does a lot of work. It's almost like an interagency question, right? From that perspective. And going back, the indigenous don't see disasters as something to respond to. They're just part of a cycle, right? So my career started with Hurricane Andrew in Miami and has just had chapters after each disaster because they happen, they're part of a cycle. And what I've found is applying community organizing principles to organizations. That means where I teach at Stanford, reaching out to other universities and within the university space, helping shape policy with presidents and governors. And we won a Champions of Change award from President Obama after participating in the Sandy Task Force, along with Mike Morella, who was here. Thank you, Mike, for bringing us in for some of those. And I just want to point out that interagency work is identifying those trim tabs in those organizations that are thinking about nature and its inseparability in the city, and then allying across federal, state, city around an idea of a relationship with nature. And we won one of the first IRA funded grants from EPA for Miami-Dade County, and we're working with Meyer and all their agencies from the inside out with federal funding. And that's significant because the first time you had such a large amount of funding go straight from the feds to communities rather than caught up in the bureaucracies of layer between community and federal dollars. So I want to point that collapsing and efficiency is having quite an impact, and it bypasses a lot of the state politics that happens. And it's an exciting time for politics to be in line with the way that nature works in a decentralized manner.
Thank you so much. John, would you like to add?
Yeah, I'll just add, climate change doesn't recognize that 2050 is a significant year or 2100 is a significant year, and it doesn't recognize municipal or state boundaries. So clearly for the big bucks, the big moves and the big decisions, like whether to keep building in Florida on the coast, is going to have to come from the federal government or from concordance between states. But, the point I was trying to raise is if we're going to get the money spent, like the decisions made, we're going to have to do it by saying it's part of a bigger, better story. That it's not spending $1 trillion to keep the imperfections and problems and inequities we have now. It's $1.5 billion. It goes past co-benefits, I think. And in that respect, it has to be local. So, I'm not sure what the mechanisms are. If like the Regional Plan Association proposes a regional authority, Robert Moses did a whole of government approach just by having every title that is possible. So I'm not sure what the mechanism is, but that's where we have to move.
Thank you so much. Let's please thank the panelists one last time. So At this point, we're officially hitting our 10 a.m. mark, but we have the room until 11 and we're going to keep going. That applies for folks in the chat. We're going to take now questions from the audience. So what I'm going to suggest is that maybe we take a couple questions from folks and then you guys get to choose and we'll get the conversation going. As you heard before, there's bagels and coffee, so help yourselves to some of that. Hopefully, we can still sort of like use the time that we have to hear what's going on in your minds right now. Okay. So. Why don't we start?
If folks could introduce themselves, because I'm sure that we have a whole lot of expertise in this room.
Hi, I'm Sewell. Thank you. You guys have walked right out of Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. So thank you so much. And as John is pointing out, we really have to start with the local. This has to be bottom up. That's the change, right? So we badly need you. I'm going to give one example because my question really is, can you help us? We want your help within our community. We have a group that came up with a brilliant, I think, idea. It's called the Broadway Linear Park Project. They want to turn Broadway from Columbus Circle down to Union Square right here into a park. It speaks to what you were talking about, Walter. And we need help from all of you. We certainly need it from you, Noah. Certainly we need vision from you. But it starts from the bottom up. I am a mentee of Layla's, now sitting on the community board. I'm on the right committees for this, and we're going to rope in John. Can you help us? Will you help us? We need you badly.
Thank you.
Chad Nelson, CEO of the Surfrider Foundation. My question is, all of this requires local planning, local community, public participation. I spend my days giving 3-minute testimony at 10 p.m. at a city council meeting. It is not an effective way to involve and engage communities in any way. So my question is, how do we redesign community input at scale so we can do the work you're doing in the way we think it should be done?
Maybe one more and we'll hear from the panel.
Thank you so much. And Leila Logisico, president of the City Club. Thank you to all the panelists. It's really a much needed conversation. So I'm really happy that it is happening. And just to, sort of like follow up on the previous question, I just want to also emphasize, the flip side to, the difficulty to get your community input. We also know that the private sector has their own ways of actually making their message known and putting their thumb on the scale. And they're able to be very organized and to hire lobbyists and to maybe hire former civil servants who come and, serve for the purpose of, private, interest. When I hear, the public-private partnership, it always makes me shiver because the private sector is always very, very good at negotiating. That's what they do. It's their job, and they are darn good at it. And they should be. But we often see that the public sector is a little less sharp, and therefore, very often the outcome is in favor of the private sector. How do we shift that so that we can embrace the core values? And I think this is just so critical. What you said about, how things get lost in technicality, but in the end, it is always going back to the values. How do we effectuate that really drastic paradigm change?
Please. We have one microphone.
Yes.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay.
Sorry. That's a hot button.
Yeah.
It's a hot mic, and that's a hot button topic, and it's connected to what Mark Nelson said. So if you don't manage capitalism, it will manage your decisions for you. We have to, nature is decentralized, capitalism is decentralized, right? There's an academic part of this talk where I discuss how the marketplace itself follows the path of the least resistance, and so does water. It follows the path of least resistance. So these are just another version of how we're inseparable from nature. So The markets are nature, and a lot of my work is putting ROIs on these decisions, working with the markets because they do bring efficiencies to the public dollar. And a lot of the work we deliver is public-private partnership projects. The stuff you saw in Miami, we're building here in New York City. We have Arvern East, the first net zero neighborhood in New York City. Half of my career has been planning that project, and we finally got a cloudburst street built. 1.5 miles of that stuff that you saw is now, you can go see it in Rockaway. But we had to work across agencies, work across markets, show the return on investment. But we were able, after a decade, to get DOT to allow stormwater to flow off their street into a Parks Department area that is co-managed by Parks Department. In New York City, that is like brain surgery. It's not easy. Now, on the community side, that work came out of an approach that we use in our firm called community as brain trust. That just having listening sessions and empowering is not enough. The community are experts of their zone. And one of the questions that came up is, how do we design gentrification-proof future neighborhoods? Because housing, it's a crisis. And how do we shift from affordable rental to affordable home ownership? And not only is RNEs happening, but in that whole area, what emerged is a community-led, collectively owned, the Edgemere Community Land Trust, and HPD gave the Housing Preservation Development in New York City awarded these, and it's 67% minority neighborhood, matriarchs from the neighborhood organize and are now making decisions about the future of their community. So there's a lot of hope there in the community as brain trust.
Thank you. Anything else? Oh, go ahead, please.
I think I'd invite us also to shift even from thinking about community engagement to community partnership, which can make some folks uncomfortable. I also just ask us to all to sit with the reality that the reason that sometimes it's hard to engage a partner is because people have gotten really hurt before. Or it's just not been worth their time, right? It's been a check the box exercise. And rather than us saying like, well, that wasn't me, that was another administration that was before me, et cetera, like my intentions are good. I think that going back to that heal and regenerate, we give nature time to heal and regenerate. We have to recognize that that any of these projects, whether it's Broadway or anything else, actually give us a container to heal some of that abuse of power that has happened in our cities, in our communities of the past. And so if we don't invest in addressing, we just did some work in Kingston, New York around broken promises, and we've done this work in Cleveland and other places that allow people to see themselves and hold these projects, but not just these projects, right? For these projects that we do then to be kind of a gateway to different kinds of civic engagement and different power structures, then we recognize how all these projects are interconnected. But that's a very different way of approaching community engagement rather than we have this project we think we need to do and we need to get the community to come give us their input on this project. And then next time we have a project, we're going to start all over again trying to engage the community rather than just us understanding how all these projects are connected, which means that the power shifting has to be connected.
So as the mayor of a small town, city council member, I think these questions are all connected. And Mark, thank you especially for yours about community engagement. I've learned that no amount of community engagement is actually ever enough. No matter what we do, somebody didn't get the notice, someone wasn't able to join, wasn't able to have their voice heard. And so I always think about the Margaret Mead quote, never doubt the power of a few thoughtful citizens to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that has ever done so, something like that. We all play a role. We may never actually solve your really important question, but we all play a role, and we have to keep coming to those meetings and creating those meetings. When I was elected, I started our sea level rise task force because we had flooding. We're a bayfront community, and I can't say how many people said to me about, I live on a hill. Sausalito is a hillside community. I live on a hill. I'm never going to flood. And I said, okay, wait a second. You want to talk about climate or sea level rise? Do you flush your toilet? Yeah. Of course, flush my toilet. Do you turn your lights on? Yeah, of course I do. Right. All of that infrastructure lives on the low-lying ground that's going to flood. Okay, now we have some engagement, right? And so some of it is the narrative and meeting people where they are and understanding. The other thing I'll just put a push for, it's election season, down ballot races, right? Starting with school boards, my goodness, like that is how our children are learning about these issues. And we're seeing all parts of the country that these are being overtaken on the right. So vote.
Rob.
Definitely vote. I'll also just say that, you know, these questions are also connected to ensuring that we're hearing from the most underserved communities, right? The voices that haven't been at the table traditionally. And I just want to say that, like, your federal agencies are doing a lot of hard work in that regard right now. You know, NOAA held its first Equity and Climate Justice Forum earlier this year, where we brought our own team together. We have a 12,000 person agency. It wasn't all 12,000 people, but we started to bring our employees together and we invited our partners, right? Our community-based partners to be in dialogue, to learn, and even more difficult, unlearn our, you know, what the things that we've been taught, to start undoing those biases, right? And interact in a more genuine and authentic way. And brainstorm, figure out solutions, like let's redesign our community engagement processes. Those kinds of conversations were happening in those rooms. We're taking a look at equitable grant making, right? It's really hard to apply for a federal grant. It takes a lot of capacity. And we're not going to be able to change the entire system ourselves at our agency. However, there are things that we can do to make it easier, to make grants more accessible. So we're taking a look at where we get in our own way from reaching historically underserved communities, from reaching lower capacity communities. And I think there's a lot of innovation on this front too, especially with the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act programs. You know, we've invested in capacity building, we've invested in partnership. There's not usually money for capacity building and planning and design and partnership building. So those have been, I think, really meaningful experiences for the communities that have received those infusions of capital, but also for us as an agency, because we've learned so much, right? We created a criteria in one of our notices of funding opportunities around meaningful engagement. And then people started asking us, well, what do you mean by meaningful engagement? And it prompted us to really think about what we mean by meaningful engagement, you know, and so those, you know, I think these conversations in many cases are happening for the first time, but they're laying a foundation that I think is really valuable.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. These are very candid. So I know that there were some other hands on this. I'm gonna go to you, but I'm gonna first ask Lauren if we can please read some questions from the chat, and I encourage everybody to pose a question. Let us know what you're thinking.
Yeah, I believe we have two questions in the chat, so I'll be the avatar here. The first question is, did anyone start with a statewide audit of nature-based infrastructure to protect as part of their planning? Or are you aware of anyone that did that?
And the second question?
Well, they're not related, so that's the first person's question. Do you want me to read it again?
Yes, yes.
Oh, no, read the second one so that we can.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. And the second question is, what is the progress on 30/30 water preservation? What are the thoughts and initiatives on how to move forward on that?
Yeah. Do you want to do more? We talk about saying first.
Yeah, I'll take the second one. So the White House Council on Environmental Quality actually released a conservation atlas earlier this year that demonstrated progress towards our 30 by 30 goal. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think it says that we have conserved about a third of our US waters. And I think, you know, I'm going to be very frank here. That report generated a lot of consternation in the environmental community. People, you know, asked us how we're defining what is conserved. And essentially, I think a lot of the friction was around, you know, are we allowing fishing in what we're calling conserved areas? So certainly that number that was put out does allow some areas that where fishing is still an allowable activity. And our National Marine Sanctuary Program does a lot of work to figure out what makes sense for a particular area. And that's done in partnership with communities. So it's not a prohibition across the board that there's no fishing allowed in sanctuaries, but rather there's conversations with community and regulations are developed accordingly. But I think that for me, I'll just share personally, this whole experience has really, I think, prompted me to consider, what do we define as conservation success? Because a lot of those conserved areas are also out in the Pacific Islands, right? In remote areas. And I see sort of a NIMBYism developing with conservation, right? Are we only going to say, oh yeah, that area is fully conserved if it's out far away from my beach, my commerce, the fishery that I like to fish in? That's the area that I want fully conserved. I think that's problematic. I also got to visit a couple of communities in Maine earlier this year, actually on Earth Day, where they were conserving their salt marsh, actually removing roads and bridges to give space for their salt marsh to migrate with sea level rise, because they see their salt marsh as critical to keeping the rest of their roads dry. Isn't that conservation success too? I think thinking about how we define conservation success in alignment with community priorities, I think this is like very related to the previous set of questions, is going to be something that we have to grapple with. And it's not a popular view among the pure environmentalists, I will say that too. But I think it's something that deserves more conversation and attention.
We have one more from the chat, and then I'll close out the chat. The question is, if decisions are more localized, how do we coordinate them on a larger scale, e.g. regional? So how are we scaling up?
So that's a great question, because that is our biggest problem for local land use planning. It's a lot of work in place or in play right now around creating governance for that. So I'll give you an example from California. San Francisco Airport is located in San Mateo County. That has many different cities that are involved with some of the waterfront area there. They developed what's called a special district, One Shoreline. It's an excellent example of how communities can come together, pay into it from their own coffers, and develop a regional plan. This governance is really hard. How do we, and part of it is because of the competitive grant process at both the state and federal level. As a leader of my community, why am I, going up against my neighbor for the same type of grant funding when my project could potentially, push water their direction, or theirs could push water in my direction, right? We have to coordinate that effort, which is why at my nonprofit, I often say we need to move beyond collaboration towards coordination. And so that's a really important question. I don't think we have a ton of great answers, but we have some very good examples. So BCDC, the Bay Conservation Development Commission in California, is working on a regional governance structure. As I mentioned, San Mateo, there's some great examples out of the Northeast and New England, I'm sure you could speak to. But it is, I think, probably one of the key policy and regulatory issues of our time.
All land use and environmental regulations flow from the state within the constraints of the Constitution and some federal legislation. So the states have enormous ability to get municipalities to cooperate on land use, but they have to step forward. It's that simple. And I think one of the concepts, and this speaks to Layla's and your questions, is something called cross-acceptance, where the states set the standards and the expectations, and then it's up to the municipalities to innovate in their own way with their own communities. If they fail to do it, the state intervenes. The perfect example of this is affordable housing in California, Massachusetts, New Jersey. There's been proposals in Connecticut, where if a municipality does not provide its fair share of affordable housing, the state says, developers, you can sue and build wherever you want. And in short order, the municipalities figure this out.
Counterpoint. There's also an issue in the loss of local control and a belief that one size fits all for every single community. And that's the counterbalance to state mandated restrictions. Now, we've seen it coming down in the housing world, but we haven't seen it within climate work. And so I'd be very curious to see what that would look like. You probably have a lot of stories from Southern California, a lot of the surf spots, Oceanside, Del Mar, Encinitas, losing massive amounts of sand. And there's huge beach renourishment projects. Is that a county problem? Is that a state problem? Is that a local problem? Because they're all interconnected and the tide will go where the tide wants. One cannot simply divide it and conquer. So there is a tension between a state mandate and leadership with loss of local control and the belief that there's a one size fits all. But it's a good debate to have.
The beauty of cross acceptance is it doesn't pick the solutions. It picks the standard. And the municipality picks the solutions, or the community picks the solution and then is held accountable for it. Yes, there can be abuse on the top down and the legislation and non-appropriateness, just as the town of Scarsdale will find a way to somehow avoid doing affordable housing forever.
Thanks again. Thanks again. These are great questions. Thank you for the questions. Also, I appreciate the back and forth. This speaks to the complexity of the challenges ahead. Now we're going to turn to questions here in the room. The gentleman in the back, if you can please introduce yourself and say your question.
Thank you so much. My name is Ali. I'm coming from Tanzania. It's part of West Africa, and I'm glad to be here. And the conversation is really, really helpful and very, very engaging. And there is a lot of things that we can really learn and replicate back in Africa, and whereby from the place that I work, we are coordinating a climate resilience program, building climate resilience capacity to communities that have been highly affected by climate change. And you can see in Dodoma, it's a very dry area, very semi-arid area, but how do we do it? We do trainings in climate smart agriculture, but in terms of the water, over here it seems that there is a lot of water, but over there is less amount of water. So how do we do it? We do rainwater harvesting and harvesting the rainwater so that they can be able to be used from one rainy season to another. So my question comes to, even in terms of the sea, rising the sea level in Zanzibar, many people have heard of Zanzibar, but in reality that's the sea level is rising and, it's coming to the land. But how do we do it? We plant mangrove tree that helps to fight the intrusion of the seawater. So my question is to the expert, how replicable these techniques, this innovative solution they can be, and how can we take it from now, from New York, from the community, from the state that you're doing, and how can we take it from the larger part of the world, not just here, but from the place that I come from? Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to hear two more questions. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Shapiro. I'm the Managing Director of Environment and Culture Partners. We work with arts and cultural organizations to do climate work. And I just thank you all for being here. Something I also less of a question, more of a statement is you mentioned school boards. I would also say leveraging anything for communities, arts and culture. Think about your libraries, museums, cultural centers. Those are places that a lot of the community, not just engagement, really partnerships are happening, and having those as conversations, having those conversations there. Museums are really also modeling a lot of this work too. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for that interconnectedness across sectors. And so something, even with NOAA today, the climate literacy guide is coming out, which I'm very excited about. And we're going to look to tailor that, right? Have like an appendix for cultural institutions. So I think thinking about where everyone is coming from, working together isn't just calling someone up and partnering, but really being able to bring people together across those sectors. So thank you. And I think integrating all of these nature-based solutions are something, especially nature centers and children's museums are looking at as well.
Hi, Julie Snow, Department of Commerce. So I think of education as a foundation for paradigm shifts. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how best to integrate the idea that nature and humans are inseparable. There's that link. How do you integrate it into our education system so that we have this foundation moving forward where everyone is, thinking that same way, has that same value?
Thank you. Back to the panel.
Okay. Two thoughts on that. And I assume you're discussing public education, younger children. Most of my experience is in college, university. I'm going to share one experience from that. I usually teach graduate school, PhD level, but recently at Stanford, I'm teaching undergrads. It's a totally different approach. It's more like elementary, you're exploring, you're learning, you're a sponge. Come into grad school, you're on a mission, you're coming out with a target, right? And I recently, I teach a course called Climate Justice in the Megacity. We compare megacities and how climate justice seeds grow quickly, scale up, and have an impact. And last year, we had a field trip, and we're going through the waste justice lens. We brought the undergrads. These are, freshman, sophomore, and it's a small group, and we're at a sanitation department composting facility. And that field trip had quite an impact. The class itself had an impact, not on the students, but on the way that the companies that sell compostable takeout food is being processed. So for example, what's amazing about this one facility is big, a big reuse in Brooklyn. It's mostly like Berkeley grads, and they're in this landfill sweating it out. I mean, it's awesome. It's like, and one of the students who happened to be Bill Gates' daughter, Phoebe Gates, was my student. And she says, "Oh, I know that composting takeout brand." And the guy picks it up and he goes, "Oh, this one?" He goes, "This is the worst because it has PFAS and it doesn't break down, and it takes forever to break down. And then there's PFAS. It's a forever chemical." And she goes, "Are you serious?" She goes, so she's texting while this is happening to the person who's funding this company. And he says, "What are you doing for this PFAS?" And they said, "Oh, we've been exploring an alternative for that." And so I get a message a week later that she says they've quadrupled the amount of minds in that company working on this problem because of that text. So my point is that sometimes a class, sometimes a field trip, those field visits, and they're like, "How did you find this out?" She goes, "I'm literally at an effing dump." So, and then I'll share on the academic side. I mean, I'm a father of a 6 and 11-year-old, and I try to raise them with nature. They grow their own food. Their friends don't think it's weird in Brooklyn that they grow kale and it's their favorite food and share it with their friends. I love that I can live in a place where that's normal. And they're very much anti-sugar, and their friends are anti-sugar, right? So a lot of it is experience, getting your feet, on the ground, taking off your shoes and grounding with the soil, with the earth. And I think that applies to undergrad all the way through to toddler, pre-K. It's getting that experiential education and connecting to nature in ways that are visceral and not just through the textbook.
Thank you. Go ahead, Katya.
Yeah. So there are two specific things to this point I wanted examples. One is, I don't know whether it's still going, but there used to be a program that run out of Princeton University called Quest. What Quest realized is that public school, grade school teachers are afraid of science because science has been taught so badly in this country. It's the scary thing, it's the hard thing, it's the et cetera, right? And so not only are they sort of teaching to a very limited curriculum, but there are many, many people who are teachers who were not taught that science is about curiosity, science is about getting your feet in mud, science is about all that other stuff. And so what Quest does is teachers would spend a summer splashing around in streams and basically being kids again and learning that that is science so they could bring that back to the classroom. So I think that some of this is also about we have to recognize the ways like that sort of all of this is going to trickle down, and that's and then the other thing I will say is, you mentioned you have 11-year-old. Let's not forget the power of second and third graders. Are there any other Gen Xers in the room? Anybody remember Woodsy the owl, give a hoot, don't pollute? That was super powerful. And do you know one of the reasons it was so powerful is because second and third graders would shame their parents, our parents, when it was the age that McDonald's was starting to, right? Like people were accumulating more trash as we drove, and they would shame their parents when they threw the trash out of the window. And any of us that have had second and third graders know that you want nothing but to get them to stop whining at you. And I say that with a smile, but actually I think that there is a way that we talk so much at adults. And then when we talk at kids, we're trying to train them to be mini adults, and we aren't leveraging the power of social connectedness actually to drive social change. And we don't think about little kids as the change makers that they could be.
Thank you.
That's right. Yeah, sorry, I could go on about school lunches and state legislatures, but I want to get to this other gentleman's question. I just want to, and we could talk after this, there is a wonderful project out of the Stimson Center. It's Stimson with an M as in Michael. It's called the Corvi Vulnerability Assessment. And what it does is a master checklist that looks at a number of different factors, including well-being, cultural adaptation, and ecosystem health to developing projects, and it help match providers with folks who need that type of work in other parts of the country. And so it's a really interesting work on the sea level rise front, and started and proposed by someone who was in commerce for a long time, actually.
Thank you, John. Janelle, John?
So I'm going to circle back to one earlier question about a statewide or regional assessment of environmental things worthy of preservation. And I agree with the earlier statement. You know, it depends on what you want to really look at, including reconstructed wetlands, the potential, but we now have the tools to do that. So long as we don't legislate it and keep it flexible, we have the tools to at least document and be aware of not just the existing things that are worth preserving, but what was there before and might be reconstructed. And then in terms of the Tanzania question, so, you know, your nation was a beacon for Africa under Julius Nyerere. And the beauty of being a beacon in Julius Nyerere was he got a lot of donations and a lot of world attention that helped. Costa Rica's doing that right now in Latin America with a nature-centered approach to their economy and foregoing an army in order to pursue that. So I don't think the solution is actually going to come from 5 people who operate in a rich country context. I think the solution is to look to your own past and to look to other nations in the global South that are innovating in this area. The only neo-colonial thing I can think of is right now, you know, a flow of money comes from carbon, what's it called again? The market in carbon, where you can. Pardon me?
Credits.
Yeah, carbon credits. Thank you. I have dyslexia, so I forget words all the time. So, you know, if somehow that could be connected to well-being, so that the credit is not just for preserving the forest, let's say, but for preserving the way of life of the people who live in that forest, or not just for something having to do with flooding on the coast, that it's also about economic opportunity for the people who live on the coast. You know, sort of you know, the co-benefit idea. But again, I would suggest co-benefit writ large, so that you can as much lead with the so-called co-benefit as you would with the environmental. Otherwise, it's got to feel in Tanzania like somehow, you know, you're bearing the brunt. The global South is bearing the brunt of climate change. Whatever we think we're dealing with in New York, it's nothing compared to the Southeast coast, which is nothing compared to the Gulf, which is nothing compared to the Mekong Valley. So, you know, there is this, I think, legitimate case to be made that there has to be a large transfer of resources.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. So go ahead.
Be brief on Tanzania. I know you're coming to New York looking for solutions to bring back to Dar es Salaam or wherever home is. You know, I gotta say that there's a lot of solutions in the region, you know, the multi-country region of East Africa. When I started my career, I had the opportunity to meet Wangari Maathai before she passed. And she did incredible things in the wild areas, Kenya, connecting the dots between peace, the forests, and gender justice. And what I think is, you mentioned trees in Zanzibar, you know, the Jamaica of Africa, which is an amazing place, has its own reggae music, you know, I think the next chapter of Wangari's legacy is to bring it to Dar es Salaam, to bring living systems into the city itself, relook at the infrastructure, every layer of infrastructure, where you get your energy from. You can get it from a renewable source. How are the streets designed? How is the waste managed? Can it all mimic nature? How much of it can be decentralized? And don't be afraid of density, because we're starting to do this in New York City. And if it works here, it works anywhere in terms of density. and just revisit every waste, energy, water, and start to take the spirit of Wangari Maathai into the city.
Thank you for that. So at this point, I hear some of our panelists have to keep going. So I'm gonna begin wrapping up. I know that there are some questions here, but I encourage all of you, especially those who have raised your hands to share your questions with the panel. We're gonna begin wrapping up and coffee will still be available there. But as we wrap up, I just wanted to pose one last question to the panel, which is you have a mix of folks working in the public sector, folks working in the private sector, there are students. What would be one quick recommendation, something that you want to sort of leave with folks as we begin to wrap up? Probably something you've said, something you've heard, anything that you want to sort of stress as we begin to close today's event.
Talk to people who are younger than 30. Because they're alarmed. I'm hearing the attitude that's akin to the attitude that I heard my brother say as the first year of the baby boom, which is you can't trust anyone over 30. They have a strong sense that we're leaving them a world that's fraught. And that sense of alarm that I think we need to have to start making decisions and spending big bucks now it is about the next generation, and we need to talk to the next generation.
Thank you, John. Jainey, you want to go next? Okay, so who wants to go next?
I have two quick things, which aren't necessarily the biggest things, but I want to go back to the community engagement and partnership, which is that we think about creation of climate jobs as how do we train people, hire people to build solar panels, to do all these other things. We also, climate jobs are training, finding, training, equipping credible messengers in communities to whether it's to do the community engagement, to do the ongoing partnership, to do the ongoing community education about climate and nature. And I think we need to think about those as climate jobs. And that also shifts money back into community, and I'll give it to somebody else rather than take.
Thank you, Katya.
Just one about diversity of thought. If you believe that genius is evenly distributed in humanity, that something's been missed for the past few decades, and we need to mix that up and get more genius on the mic. But that doesn't mean just minority participation. It's actually this diversity of professions. So my next session for Climate Week is going to be on Thursday as part of the Cloudbursts with CUNY and SRI, Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay. And in that, it's the Copenhagen relationship with New York City, sister city, around cloudbursts. And why is that important? Well, last year, at the same session last year, I was sitting across from the city manager of Copenhagen, and she said, we used to be like American cities decades ago in Copenhagen. 90% of the staff making decisions of the public dollar was one single profession, engineering. Now we need engineers. This is not a diss on engineers. It's a diss on homogeneity. And she said, we had the same type of cities as, the US. We had traffic engineered cities, right? And now there's a book that recently was released called Killed by a Traffic Engineer, right? So it gives you some ways to counter-argue the traffic engineering formulas and center it back on people in cities. But she said they made a decision to change the mix of professionals in Copenhagen and part of their legislation, part of their policy. And she says, we still need the engineers. They just don't have to be 9 out of 10 people making decisions. We need planners, we need scientists, and most importantly, we need artists. And she said, we even have linguists and the most, narrow liberal arts degrees, whatever it is. And there's a mix, and it's an even mix. And she said, as a result, a generation later, when Copenhagen was hit by a 5-inch-per-hour rain event, and what emerged was this, for the world, this cloudburst strategy, which is planning a city for extreme rain that has no name, no name storms. And she says, not only can we innovate a design, but it doesn't get shelved because everyone's focused on innovating during construction and innovating operation and maintenance all the way through. because you have multiple minds stewarding this idea. And I thought that just, it's part of our problem in our cities. Wherever I work is 90% are engineers making these decisions, and they're not the problem, the engineers singularly. It's we need more professionals. As a landscape architect, I would be concerned if I was in a city that was 90% landscape architects. It's not the engineering, it's the issue.
Thank you, Walter.
Yeah, this is great, you guys. I'm reminded of what Michelle Obama said at the Democratic Convention when she was talking about what Kamala Harris's mom would say to her. It's just don't just sit around and complain, do something, right? Literally the best thing you could do is something. The squeaky wheel does get the grease in local politics. So show up and be a part of that. I also want to pick up a theme that Katya brought up about education. Part of that is the narrative. You know, if someone doesn't want to meet you where you are, try to meet them where they are, and think about your language choice and think about the conversation and what your outcome that you're driving towards. I often talk about infrastructure instead of the climate crisis, but I know that it's flooding from the climate crisis. But, you know, I'll talk about infrastructure, and I think about that with jobs too. The number one problem for young people in California and probably across the country is the high cost of living. And so I want to talk about education and jobs and vocational programs, apprenticeship programs, so that we can address the green energy transition, so we can engage with the blue economy and make smart choices. But, you know, when I go down to the Central Valley, I'm talking about education. Not talking about coastlines, but we may get there together nonetheless. So I think about the narrative and think about the word choice. And the last thing I'll say, a really great point about the homogeneity. With my nonprofit, we have proposed what we're calling regional advisory boards, modeled after what a startup would do with advisory boards, which are teams of interdisciplinary experts, 15 to 20 people, to engage with communities that don't have a CRO or CSO to help them both identify the issue and problem solve. In law school, they teach you the IRAC method. I'm a lawyer. It's issue, reasoning, analysis, and conclusion. Actually identifying the problem is one of the largest obstacles to success. And so if you have interdisciplinary minds at work, it can be really, really interesting. You're good? Okay.
Okay, well, perfect. Join me one last time in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much.